Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Constant Writers. This is the podcast where I, Dave Musson, hello, at Dave Musson on Instagram by the way, this is the show where I talk to indie horror authors about them, their work, and their relationship with Stephen King. So in each episode, I will introduce you to a new indie horror author who may well end up being your new favourite author. And you'll get to know them a bit better, you'll get to understand their love of writing and reading, you'll get to learn a bit more about their work, and then, of course, because I am a Stephen King fan, and most of the people I'm talking to are Stephen King fans, we geek out about Stephen King. So we chat about the influence the master of horror has on them and their writing, and then we go deep on one book in particular before we wrap up with the quickfire 19-question Stephen King challenge. So if that sounds like something you would like more of, stick around for this episode because it's a great one. But when you're done, go and listen to some of the others. Subscribe, follow, whichever you need to do, wherever you're consuming this podcast. You can watch these interviews on YouTube, you can listen wherever you get them, and hey, tell a friend as well. Now, before I introduce this week's guest, the fantastic Spencer Hamilton, just a couple of quick plugs from me. You can pick up some of my fiction, which is on Amazon. You can pick up my quiz book, The Ultimate Stephen King quiz book, on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And in the description for this episode, you will find links to join up to my newsletter, and that gets you some short stories from me every week, some more indie horror recommendations every week, and you get a book of my fiction for free just for signing up. So go and do that. Anyway, plugs over. Now on to the important bit. This week's guest, Spencer Hamilton, who is the author of Kitchen Sink, a terrific collection of short stories, and is perhaps most widely known for his Smileyland series, a really twisted, creepy theme park slashery type stuff that you may see popping up here, there, and everywhere. And we'll talk about plenty in this interview. Spencer is also one of the leading lights in the queer horror scene, and we talk a bit about that as well. Lots of interesting conversations around queer characters and whether mainstream authors are doing enough to make queer characters more just a normal part of their stories, and what this community is like for queer writers. There's some really great stuff there. And then we go into King, and we talk about all the usual questions on Stephen King and Spencer's book of choice. For the second episode running, we're talking about It. But hey, look, it's a chunky book. It deserves lots of discussion. And then, as I said earlier, we wrap up with Spencer's take on the 19-question quickfire challenge. So get comfy, settle down, settle in, and come and meet Spencer Hamilton. I think you're really going to enjoy it, and I will see you on the other side. Spencer, welcome to Constant Writers. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
I'm really well, thanks. I'm really excited to talk to you. I know we've been planning this for a while, and we've finally been able to make it happen. So yeah, really buzzing to talk about this. I mean, obviously we're going to get into Stephen King later, as we do in all of these chats. But again, as we do in all these chats, I want to start by talking about you, and we've got lots to talk about. So first question I always ask all of my guests on this podcast, like, what's your origin story with all things literature? Like, when did you fall in love with writing and I guess with reading as well?
Well, with reading, it's been since the very beginning. With I imagine a lot of your guests have this answer in their pocket, which is Goosebumps. Mm-hmm. Very easy reads for children and scary as hell and just a wild ride. And that's kind of how I got my start. But I think my true love for just reading in general and not horror specific was my fourth grade teacher handed me a copy of The Hobbit. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I guess even the cover of that book, I don't know if you're familiar, there's a cover with Bilbo holding Sting when it's blue, and he's like in a cave, probably the cave where he meets Gollum, and it's very eldritch, and that cover really spoke to me, and I loved the book, and from then on it was off to the races. But for writing, there's a joke I say, which is the only thing that I wanted to be before I wanted to be a writer was Spider-Man. Essentially, it's one of the very first memories of that question, what do you want to be when you grow up, that I remember having. I want to be an author. I want to write books. So it's been pretty long, I guess.
And so if you've had that lifelong ambition to do this, like when did you actually start taking it more seriously? What made you realize you could actually do it?
Well, I futzed around with it a lot as a kid, writing stories. There was this perennial fantasy novel that I was writing for, from age 11 to college that never came about, but I think when it became a true option for me, I was I had trained to be an editor, a copy editor, and was entering the space of self-publishing as a freelancer, and was going to conventions and meeting a lot of authors, and getting to know the world of publishing and self-publishing a lot more, and realized not only is it something that I could do, um, but in my opinion, from what I was seeing and experiencing, it was the most viable option, not just for me, but for anyone who wants to be a writer. And so, it was a lifelong dream of mine, and I saw actual actionable steps toward it. So I dove in, and I remember when I was first starting, the question was, well, what genre do I want to write?
Mm-hmm.
And I did a lot of searching because I'm pretty wide in the genres that I read,
Mm.
but it's not considered good business to write a bunch of different genres as an author, and and it took a bit of soul searching. But once I did, it was almost laughable how obvious it was that I always gravitated toward horror.
Mm.
So I I threw the fantasy novel in my trunk, never to open again, and collected all of the short fiction that I had written over the years, because I figured, hey, starting my publishing career with a short story collection sounds good to me because short stories are a favorite of mine. And
Mm-hmm.
when I did that, I saw a through line of horror. Um, and once I saw that, it was a pretty easy decision. And I'll never regret it. I'm completely in with horror now. It's kind of been an interesting experience to see that I've always gravitated toward it and always
Mm.
loved it, but for some reason I've never put a name to that.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, I could sit here uh and self-diagnose and say, well, it's, that's the product of growing up in a conservative household when horror is like a bad word.
Mm-hmm.
But but yeah, I am very happy to be where I am now.
I mean, I remember first coming across your name and your work, probably with your pandemic story, The Fear. I mean, it was a striking artwork that really hooked me in at first before I read it.
Mm.
And I have to say, I really admire how you just weren't shy at all in releasing that while we were still in the midst of that global COVID pandemic. I mean, from my point of view, the story's great, and I think it certainly stands up on its own. But were you at all worried that people would just be like, I don't need this right now. I don't want to read something so close to home, or was it actually a case of, no, this is like, I'm going to strike while the iron's hot. I'm going to get this out here and allow people to sort of, I don't know, try and process this pandemic through this story. Like, what was the decision process for putting that one out there when you did?
Well, it's a great question because it's such an interesting moment in time that we kind of all share is
Mm.
the pandemic. There's few things in history that I think everyone in the world um, experienced at the same time. And this was one of those moments, and a lot of people had to find ways to stay sane, especially in the first lockdowns. And so writing the fear began as, I had just put out Kitchen Sink, and I had just put out my first book, and I was looking to publish a novel, and so I had to ask myself, well, what is the novel going to be? And then I found myself in lockdown and needed ways to process what I was going through, and so I started writing this book, and it was largely therapeutic, for my own sanity, and not just in going stir crazy in the pandemic, but also kind of sifting through a lot of internal mental health that I was going through at the time. And so it really was very, very therapeutic and cathartic. And I put it out, and I was, as you said, I was terrified that people would not want to touch this thing with a 32-foot pole. And the idea of striking while the iron is hot is, to me, laughable. I had a review, or maybe a few, accused me of just trying to make a quick buck.
Mm-hmm.
And that always made me laugh, because I think if you know the process of publishing, it is, especially self-publishing, it is not a quick buck industry.
No.
And I never wrote the thing to make money. When it comes to writing, that's not my why. And so I knew going in that it would be a hard sell, and it would be polarizing. And there would be readers who would dismiss it out of hand because they don't need it. But, some people, I think it comes down to, if I could generalize, there are two kinds of people. There are the people who look directly at the monster that's coming at them, because all information helps their anxiety. And I certainly know that's how I am. When the pandemic started, the first thing I did was crack open The Stand and reread that. And then there are people who need an escape, and need to turn to fantasy, and maybe feel good beach reads and stuff when they're living through a horror, like we were at the time. And I'm definitely in the first category, and so that's why I wrote it, and I was hoping it would find readers like me.
Yeah, and I mean, from the reaction I've seen online, I think it's overwhelmingly positive, sort of far outweighing those ones who perhaps are like wrong time, or like you said, to accuse you of trying to make a quick buck. So I hope you feel justified in putting it out, because it's certainly one I enjoyed. You mentioned Kitchen Sink as well, which is another one I have. Actually have this physical copy on my shelf rather than just a Kindle copy. And I'm guessing the name Kitchen Sink is because, as you say, it's all of your stories thrown in. Is that where it comes from by any chance?
Yeah, well, it actually comes from Stephen King's Nightmares and Dreamscapes.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading that book at the time when I was trying to answer what kind of author would I be.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember being astonished at the kind of stuff that he was putting in that book.
Yeah.
It's like 300,000 words, which is insane, especially for a short story collection. And there's a screenplay in there, there's a poem, there's a nonfiction essay about his son's baseball team, and it's quite bizarre. But I mean, I had heard that joke about how publishers would publish Stephen King's grocery list.
Yeah.
But after reading that book, you kind of see, well, maybe there's a little truth to it. No, I did love that book. It was just so unwieldy, and I didn't really know what to make of it. And um, I remember thinking, well, hell, like maybe he's onto something here. And so I pulled together all the stories that I had finished or wanted to finish, and sent it to my editor and was like, hey, is there something here? And she wanted me to cut a few stories, like, there is a fantasy story in there. Um, and she also, I think, understandably so, wanted me to cut stories that I wrote when I was a teenager that are in there. And I held to the concept mainly because of that Stephen King collection. And I'm very glad I did. All of those stories that were on the chopping block have featured in reviews as favorites. And what I love about the kitchen sink concept is there is a through line, right, which I talk about in the introduction to the book, but there's so many different kinds of stories in there that ultimately readers' lists of favorite stories have run the gamut, and that's been really fun for me to watch.
Yeah. And I was going to ask as well, I mean, short stories is a topic that comes up time and time again in these interviews. And obviously with Stephen King, it's a big part of his career as well. Like, how important do you think it is for a horror author in particular to have sort of short stories as part of their arsenal?
Specifically horror, I think short stories they cater to the genre almost. You look at the origins of the genre, and short fiction, I mean, with Edgar Allan Poe,
Yeah.
is just massive. I remember The Telltale Heart was just incredibly formative for me as a child. And Ray Bradbury's The Sound of Thunder, and I mean, Ray Bradbury has so many. He's not specifically a horror writer, but he definitely kept returning to that topic. And then you have these other story forms that are similar to the short story, like the Twilight Zone, or Tales from the Crypt. These very short, I think morality tales fit into short fiction really well. Short fiction as a story form is very, it allows and almost encourages experimentation. There's just so much freedom and different ways to go with the short story. And Stephen King, he's known for these door stoppers like The Stand, but he has hundreds of short stories that are just as great. And so I think that short fiction as a story form in horror is indispensable.
Definitely. And it's a challenge to like get under someone's skin in a short word count as well, right? Like doing it over a novel is one thing, but doing it with a quick punch is quite something else.
Absolutely.
I mean, I guess now you're perhaps best known for your Smileyland stories and that world that you've been building and kind of just dotting around in various publications over the last few years. I guess to start on that, for people watching and listening who perhaps haven't gone in on Smileyland yet, could you maybe give them like the elevator pitch for that series, and maybe just give a bit of background as to where the inspiration came from as well?
Yeah, Smileyland is an abandoned amusement park that a certain malevolent force keeps drawing people to. And, it borrows a lot from classic slashers, but also from supernatural stuff. Like Smileyland is alive. Like like the Overlook Hotel. And and it the inspiration for it is not very exciting, to be honest. I was about to put out The Fear, and I needed a freebie to be able to give people as an incentive to join my newsletter. And so I went onto a pre-made cover artist's website and was cruising images of pre-made covers, and I came across this image of a smiley face with a skull peeking through these rips. And I was going for something just high octane fun. And that image spoke to me. And so I came up with the idea of a theme park whose theme is, never stop smiling.
Yeah.
I think laughter and horror are very closely linked,
Yeah.
That release, which I think is why a lot of people who go to horror movies will find themselves laughing, sometimes at the most messed up stuff.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because I do think that they're, two peas in a pod. And so that idea of always smiling is inherently horrific to me. And yeah, so it does have a simple beginning, but once I wrote the first one, which is called Welcome to Smileyland, I was so in love with the world, and readers, as you said, really responded. And so I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to be staying in Smileyland for a bit.
Yeah. And I've noticed with the Smileyland stories, as I said earlier, they do seem to sort of be dropped around in various places. I mean, there's some self-published stuff, there's some that have appeared in anthologies. Is that a deliberate ploy to sort of give people as many entry points into this world as possible?
Yeah. I see it as a big arena to play in. And I don't necessarily want it to be this long overarching series that you have to read in order. I want a bunch of different entry points. I think one of the side effects of horror is a lot of characters bite it at the end of their story, and so sequels can be a hard thing to do. And so I just kind of lean into that, and they are all connected. So I do want to give that reward and payoff to people who want to read everything. But also, if you're looking for a slasher in the 90s, or if you're looking for religious horror in the early 20th century, or all these different starting points, I want to give a lot of different and fun beginnings.
And something I definitely wanted to cover before we move on to King, that connected to the Smileyland stuff, was I think probably your writing's biggest impact on me, and that's just the inclusion of non-binary characters who just use they them pronouns, for example. I mean, if I remember correctly, the lead in Welcome to Smileyland's pronouns are they them, and I won't lie, initially my cis brain was just like completely flummoxed when I first started reading it. Just for those first few uses of it, I was just like, what am I missing here? Admittedly, I had very young children at that time, so I was probably also very tired. But anyway, I think the biggest thing I took from it was that I actually really appreciated being jolted out of my comfort zone. And I don't know if I told you this, but like since reading that story, in my own writing, I've just started including more non-binary characters, and that's directly inspired by your work.
Wow.
I mean, I guess my question would really, to start this, would be like, how important is it to you to not only have queer and non-binary characters, but also to do it in a way where that is not their defining feature?
Well, to answer that question, it's very important. Crucial, I think. In my storytelling, I've decided that that is very important to me. And so I've tried to prioritize it. And, I think it's like you said, to not make that queer identity the sole purpose of the character or the sole struggle that the character's going through, and to just have it be a part of them is this way of normalizing um, different identities. And I think we're kind of seeing that a lot, especially in horror these days. And there needs to be more,
Hmm.
you know? And I do want to say, though, I love that you said, it was a jolt at first
Yeah.
to have a main character with they, them pronouns. And I've seen that from several reviews for the book. And what I've appreciated about it is usually they've said, similar to you, is, it was a jolt at first, and then my brain just kind of clicked after a bit, and it was simple. And I think that's kind of the point for me,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that ended up being the point for me as well, which I think it just shows the power of it really. And I mean, I guess this is admittedly coming from my sort of straight guy perspective, but I get the sense that the indie horror scene is one where queer authors, where LGBTQIA plus authors, where they can really flourish, and they can hesitate to use the word safe space, but they can feel like that is a safe space. Do you feel that that's the case for this scene?
I do. Indie horror as a community is a very loud booster of queer stories. And I think that is starting to bleed into, the upper stratosphere of horror with bigger names.
Mm-hmm.
Haley Piper and T. Kingfisher are breaking into uh, the more mainstream horror space
Mm-hmm.
with their horror, and there's so many others that are becoming so big that the traditional publishing space, which is not a very inclusive space, is perking up its ears and saying, "Oh, we can make money from that," and that's what talks to them. But as far as the indie horror space goes, absolutely, um, it loves to champion diverse voices, and that's
Mm.
my favorite part of it.
And I mean, talking indie horror and queer authors in particular, I know you were also the editor of the collection There's More of Us Than You Know, which is 13 stories from 13 queer authors. I'm guessing that was a pretty important project for you to be part of.
It was very important. When I was brought on, it was something entirely different. And um, to give credit where credit's due, I was given um, full creative charge, and so I shaped it into what it is with the title, and bringing on queer artists for the cover, and all of these things. And it was a very important and special book for me.
Hmm. And we're about to move on to a very famous author, but I just before we round off this part of the interview, I guess, do you think that there are any big mainstream authors? Do you think they're doing enough to write realistic and compelling queer characters? And are there any of those big authors that are doing it well at the moment? I know you mentioned some earlier, but in terms of perhaps one's more towards a sort of household name, is there anyone out there who you've spotted doing this well?
Well, to your first question, are mainstream authors doing enough? I'd say no.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and there are mainstream authors who are putting in an effort, which I love, and many readers out there love. But there can always be more.
Hmm.
And as far as mainstream authors that are doing it well right now, I will say it certainly wasn't mainstream when it was first published, but I would consider it mainstream now because of the M. Night Shyamalan movie that just came out, which was The Cabin at the End of the World,
Mm.
um, which has wonderful representation. Paul Tremblay is really good at lifting up voices, not just in his own books, but um, other authors that he endorses and such. And that's the kind of behavior in writing that is admirable to me. And it's also a great book.
Yeah, yeah, I'll agree with you on that. I read it. I went to see the movie and then read the book afterwards. So yeah, it's I did wonder if you'd mentioned that one, but I then it was like, no, maybe that's just me being too obvious. But no, okay, cool. All right. Well, this is a Stephen King channel, so let's talk about him a bit more. Same question I ask all of my guests to start with for this part of the interview. What does Stephen King mean to you as a fan, and what sort of place does he hold in your heart?
Stephen King has been a huge part of my journey from a very early age with his movies. That was my first entry. My friend and I would go to Blockbuster Video and find all the horror movies that we knew our parents wouldn't let us see, and we'd hole up in his bedroom and watch all these classics. And I loved it. I believe Carrie was the first one with Sissy Spacek that I saw.
Mm-hmm.
And his first books, though, I was a late bloomer into adult fiction. I mostly read children's fantasy growing up. And then I remember when I was 15, I walked into a bookstore and Stephen King's Cell had just come out, I think that day. And I saw on the cover, I saw blood and I saw the name Stephen King. And those were two things I knew that my mom would hate. So I bought it and brought it home, and I read it, and it was just mind-boggling. I loved it. I know that book, in the context of his body of work, is not particularly beloved, but I certainly loved it, and it stuck with me. It wasn't until my early 20s that I really took a shining to his larger body of work, and I started reading it from the beginning. And I'm still working through it. I've read about 60 of his books. I think that there's like 20 left or something. But it is, you can't put into words the kind of influence that he has had on the genre. I mean, he is the genre. I would also say, though, that his nonfiction writing about the genre itself is almost just as important as the work that he's contributed to it.
I love how you can say, yeah, I've read 60 of his books and there's only about 20 more left. I mean, there's very few authors you can say that about.
I've read so many of his books and there's so many left.
Yeah, exactly. My next question was like, what sort of impact do you think King's writing has had on your own writing, if any?
Big influence. I would say that, he's known for his character work.
Yeah.
And he's definitely earned that. And so that is something that I try to emulate when I write, because nobody does it like King,
Yeah. And you say you let's say for argument's sake you're about 3/4 of the way through his bibliography. Is there? I found when I did my chronological reread, I found you can see quite distinct periods of King's writing. Like there's obviously sort of substance fueled stuff early on. There's like getting sober. There's the 90s, which is more interested in perhaps domestic abuse and stuff, and there's the post-accident things. Is there any particular period so far that has really struck with you in terms of King's writing as being a favorite?
Well, I do love all the decades of King, and I've been pretty loose with my chronological read, and I've still read all of his new stuff as it comes out. So I do love the new King, and strongly disagree with anyone who talks shit about it. But your question makes me think of the beginning of his career.
Hmm.
You know, he's in his 20s, in the 70s, and every book he puts out is it's a classic now.
Yeah.
And holds up. You know, with Carrie and Salem's Lot and The Shining and The Stand. I mean, I just named his first 4 books.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I know. He's like, I see him as like the Metallica of authors, like,
Yeah.
you know, like that, just coming out of the gate with like one, two, three, four, first 5 things out, and they're all just stellar. Yeah, he's quite a talent.
So yeah, I think my favorite King period would be maybe his first dozen books leading up to it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is a nice segue because your book of choice for this conversation is it. I've
Mhm.
got a nice vintage version here to hold up to the camera. We'll get onto it in a moment. I was curious, were there any others that sort of made your shortlist for this choice? Did you have any honorable mentions that were almost the ones you went for this part of the conversation?
Yeah, well, Pet Cemetery.
Mhm.
Did you talk to Thomas Gloom about that?
Did indeed, yeah.
Um, so that, I mean, I think that's the scariest of
Mhm.
his. It's certainly the scariest that I've read. I also thought of Revival.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so those were the 3 that I considered, but I was really only considering the other 2 because I assumed that it would have already been claimed by one of your guests.
Well, we have had Christopher Badcock talking about it, funnily enough, on this season, and that's more through me not being organized and reading my messages properly. But I think actually, it's such a stellar book, and it's such an influential book that I think it warrants having 2 discussions about it. And I'm actually interested to sort of ask you guys similar questions and see how your answers vary. So it then it's like I say that relatively small, lesser known book of his from 1986, thousands of pages, different timelines. We get the Losers Club, we get Pennywise, perhaps one of the most iconic villains of all time. But that is all just me spouting stuff. Why did you pick it? What was it about it?
It, I feel, is Stephen King's greatest accomplishment. Um, well, I'm going to start by contradicting myself because I actually think that his greatest accomplishment is Dance Macabre. But in terms of his own storytelling, I think that it is his thesis statement on fear.
Hmm.
And you know, I think any other author could have retired after putting out that book. He's said what he's wanted to say, and he's gonna, you know, dust off his hands and go live his life. But um, King is compelled. Storytelling is a compulsion for him, and we're all the better for it. Uh, but but yeah, I think it's this epic statement of not just fear, but how we interact with fear, especially as children. And this may be a strange thing to say, but I think it's beautiful.
Hmm. No, I agree with you, and it's something I always say to people talking about it is that people hear about Pennywise and they perhaps know about some of the more iconic kills in here, but it's also an amazing story about friendship as well. And for that to be woven into, like you say, the Master of Horror's thesis on fear, it's it's a mind-boggling prospect in many ways. And yet you sit down and read it, and well, I don't know if you've found it similar, but the 2 times I've read this, I just fly through it because I'm just completely in that world and it hooks me in, and the different timelines just work. Everything just slots into place, and it's just one of the most joyous reading experiences I've had. I mean, what was your first reading experience of it like? Because I know some people it's one they tackled and didn't finish first time, and it took them a couple of goes. Like, how did you come about actually reading it?
Uh, I read it gearing up for the new 2017 movie.
Okay.
I was going to read the first half because, you know, I was looking and I was like, 1,100 pages. I'll save the other 500 or so for the second movie, but it turns out that's not how it worked, and I didn't want to wait, and I flew through it. Yeah, so I read it then, and then more recently I listened to the audiobook.
Okay, the one with Steven Weber doing it.
Yes.
I've heard so many good things about that, and I've never done an audiobook of King's work, and I feel like that would be the one that I'm going to go in on if and when I do, because I've just heard so many positive reports.
Yeah, I've listened to a lot of audiobooks, and when it comes to King, I'd say either you need Steven Weber or you need King himself.
Yeah, yeah. So you were reading this in preparation for the movie then, and I guess people who've read the book will know that there are quite a few amazing scenes in the book that didn't make it into any of the movies, perhaps for practicalities, and perhaps, as we'll get onto one scene in a little while, for other reasons. But how did you feel when you'd read the book and then you see the movie? Like, were you satisfied that the stuff that hooked you in from the book made it onto the screen? Was there stuff you wished? Was there stuff that didn't make it that you wished had? Like how was that as an experience for you?
Well, I was ultimately satisfied. The movie is actually one of my favorite horror movies. Um, and I guess I approach the whole, book or movie question a little differently than I think most people do. Um, I don't mind when movies take liberties. In fact, I think they should, because it is a different medium.
Yeah.
And with that comes different ways of telling story. And I think the director, Andy Machete,
Yeah.
I think he did a phenomenal job with that first movie of honoring this beloved classic while also telling a complete story with the limited time that he had. Because you're not going to fit 1,100 pages into one movie. You're not going to fit it into two movies. The second movie I love, but it's very messy.
Yeah.
And that is something that it marks it separate from that first one. I think the first one does a very good job of telling a tight story and keeping to the themes of the book. And I think that's the best way that a book can be adapted, is if the filmmakers understand what the story is trying to say.
Yeah.
And what the audience loves about that book. And I think that movie does do that.
And while we're on the movie, quick one for you. Who is your Pennywise? Is it Bill Skarsgård or is it Tim Curry?
That's also a tough question, because for years and years and years, Tim Curry was a favorite of horror lovers, right?
Yeah.
But Skarsgård, I think there are times when you have to admit that a new version of a classic did it better. I think Skarsgård owns it, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess I'm curious, like going back to the idea of like the scenes that are in the book that didn't make the movie for whatever reason. Are there any of those ones that didn't make it through that really stand out to you on the page? I mean, I know from my point of view, the one I really liked, a really small detail, but there's one where Pennywise is killing someone and he's dressed as the creature from the Black Lagoon, and you get inside the mind of the kid who's being killed, and you can see the zipper, like as a little nod to like in the movies. I just love the little details like that work brilliantly on the page. Are there any scenes that, like I say, didn't make it into the adaptations from the book that really stick out for you?
Well, I think the scenes that didn't make it, for me, the idea that Pennywise turns into all of these classic monsters, because that is what kids have been taught to be afraid of.
Yeah.
I I love that so much because of what it's saying about uh, pop culture fear.
Yeah.
But I think uh, it didn't fit the language of the film, and he does do a bit of that in the movie. There's shots of him as the mummy and these sorts of things, but not enough for someone who hasn't read the book to understand what was happening. I think, and I think that is a crucial part of the story is Pennywise turning into all these recognizable monsters.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I would say that is something that I did sorely miss.
So what do you think, what form would Pennywise take for you if you found yourself in Derry and he happened to be awake?
Something bug related.
Okay.
Bugs, man, they just that's my horror.
So the flying leeches for Patrick Hockstetter must be quite something for you.
Oh yeah, I mean, I hate associating myself with with that character.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
But yeah.
And we talked earlier about how, you said one of King's strengths is characters, and that's something that you've taken into your work. And this book is a rich menu of amazing characters. Parking the Losers Club for a moment, because I have a separate question for you about them. But taking any of the other characters from the book, who stands out for you in this one? Because there's so many that for other authors would just be a side character that I don't know. For me in this one, they almost feel like main characters, even though they're not. Like, are there any from that surrounding cast that you particularly enjoy?
Well, yeah, Patrick Hoffstetter, I think, in terms of writing a kid who is just a psychopath, that's a tall order, and it was terrifying, and particularly in the book. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it's Pennywise appears to Patrick as Frankenstein. Am I?
It's been a while. It's been a while since I read it.
Um, God, I'm going to hate this if I'm wrong, but Frankenstein is besides it maybe my other favorite horror novel, and so I do love that parallel. But yeah, Patrick's character is just unapologetically fucked up.
Yeah.
And also very believable. It's unhinged, but King roots it in reality, I think.
And to have him alongside Henry Bowers as well, like, it's like, Jesus, like an absolute dynamic duo of just horrific human monsters. It's terrifying.
It's crazy too that Patrick is he's the most messed up kid, I think, of the bunch, but Henry Bowers is the one that King chose to put center stage as the bully.
He does love a greaser bully, doesn't he? And in terms of, I said I was holding on with the Losers Club. So the Losers Club are obviously an iconic group of 7. Like, I was going to ask who's your favorite, but perhaps more interesting is like who. Perhaps it's your favorite as well, but like who do you identify with most? Like which one are you most like in that bunch?
I mean, if I were to pick one that I identify with the most, maybe Ben. I think that Mike is kind of the unsung hero of the Losers Club, and in my opinion, the outsider who stays. Everyone else gets out and has these lives of success, and he stays, and it's tragic. And I think that the second of the new movies did Mike dirty. I have to say that. I want to shout out Mike. We love him.
Yeah. And do you think, for you sitting there as an author who's, you've got a few works out there under your belt now, you've done you've tried a few different forms. Like, could you see yourself writing something as sprawling and as weighty and as ambitious as this?
Short answer, no. But I'll try.
Yeah.
No, there are a few stories that I'm almost like waiting to be able to write almost. And King himself, he was still very young when he wrote it.
Mm.
Um, God, I think maybe he was my age. I don't remember now, but yeah. So thinking of it in that context, it feels insurmountable. But I hope I can write something as as epic.
Yeah.
But only time will tell.
And lastly, on it, again, a question I used to round off all of these sections. So for anyone watching or listening who hasn't read it yet, what three words would you use to describe or sell it to somebody and convince them to give it a go?
Hmm. Um, Fear,
Mhm.
childhood friendship.
Nice. Yeah, I think that does the job. Okay, great. This has been great to have this chat, Spencer, and we are nearly done. Um, Basically, before we finish, we've got to go through the 19-question quickfire King challenge, and it's not one of these things that you sometimes see on podcasts like, "Hey, you up for doing this?" Like, we're doing this. I just wanted to let you know that that's happening and just check that you're ready to start, basically.
Cool. Okay, I like that.
Okay, so as I said, it's quick fire, so you don't need to give any explanations. I might try and get explanations out of you, but they are not required at all. So let's just go for it. You've already mentioned this, but just to confirm, what was the first King book you ever read?
So,
And what about the most recent one you've read?
the Colorado Kid.
Nice. Um, I got a guess for your answer for this one, but what's your all-time favorite King?
We've been talking about it. It's it.
I did wonder. And what about your all-time least favorite?
I gotta say, Tommy Knockers.
Even though it's got an appearance from Pennywise in. Yeah.
You think?
Yeah. What do you think is King's most underrated novel?
Definitely Revival.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, if you're listening and you have not read Revival, go read Revival.
Yeah, I'd second that definitely. It's quite something, particularly the final act. Ooh, yes. Um, in terms of artwork, which King book has your favorite cover art?
I'd say Bazaar of Bad Dreams.
Mm-hmm.
It's gorgeous.
And what about your least favorite?
This was harder. Colorado Kid, actually.
Is that the one with the woman in the dress on the red background, or is it the one with the woman on the beach who's kind of like shocked and finding the body?
Thank you for asking. It's the one with the woman in the dress.
Yeah.
It fits the trope and style that they were going for, but
Has nothing to do with the story. Yeah. Yeah. No, I can see your point on that one. What would be the one King book you could recommend to anybody?
The Green Mile.
Good choice. We've talked a little bit about King movies. So what's your favorite King adaptation?
You'd think that I'd say the 2017 It that I've been raving about, but I'm gonna say The Mist. There are others that it's just killing me not to name, but The Mist, yes.
I think that's a pretty solid choice. At the other end of the scale, what about your least favorite adaptation?
Cell, no questions asked.
If I could offer you the chance to have any King character make a cameo in your own work, who would you pick?
Well, Pennywise.
Oh, yeah. God, Pennywise in Smileyland, that is a terrifying prospect.
Yes. I think Pennywise would find himself in a fight with Smileyland.
Yeah, that would be quite something. Which King book or story even would you say is most similar to your own style of writing?
Salem's Lot.
Yeah. Cool.
It's hard to pick because it feels conceited, to name a Stephen King book as close to your own. But yeah, I would say Salem's Lot.
And for this one, I want you to give me one King book for each of these. So one King book that you keep forever. So you read, you reread, you keep reading until it falls apart, all of that kind of stuff. one that you read only once. So you read it, park it on your shelf, maybe pull it out and look at the cover occasionally, but don't read it again. And one that you would delete from existence.
Okay, so you said keep forever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Since we're talking about it. And read only once. Rage.
Mm-hmm.
And delete from existence. I'm gonna cheat here and say The Plant.
Okay.
Because he never finished it, you know? Like, I'm doing him a favor.
Yeah. Have you read The Plant out of curiosity?
I have not, no.
It's interesting. It's because it's available for free on his website. It's kind of got a prototype Jerome character from Mr. Mercedes. And it's got a lot of weirdness in there. But yeah, it's I can see why he gave up on it, because it was running out of steam somewhat. But it's I mean, I guess I'm a completist. It is interesting to see that, and knowing the story about the sort of experiment behind it as well sort of adds a bit to it. But yeah, I can see that as a good one to delete. Okay, so the final 5 questions of this 19 question challenge is a straight either or. So again, no explanation needed. But let's go. Let's see where we get to. So the book or the movie?
The book.
The Stand or It?
It.
Would you rather have a holiday in Derry or a night at the Overlook?
The Overlook.
Short story or full novel?
Short story.
And lastly, would you rather go for walkies with Cujo or have a weekend away with Annie Wilkes?
Walkies with Cujo. He didn't do anything wrong, you know? He's a victim here. He's a victim.
Yes, he's a good boy. Yes, good. I keep telling this to all these people who pick the weekend with Annie Wilkes. They're crazy, but cool. Great. Spencer, this has been so much fun and definitely worth the wait and getting this conversation locked in and sorted. Before we finish, I wanted to sort of throw the floor over to you. So please tell people where they can find out more about you, where they can find out more about your work, and tell us what you've got coming up in the rest of 2023 and beyond, like what's next for you.
Yeah. Well, Dave, again, thank you for having me on here. It's been a blast. I'm so glad we finally got to do it.
Yeah.
I would love, if you're listening or watching, come find me on Instagram at spencer.hamilton.books, or on Twitter, where I'm less frequently active. But also go to my website, spencerhamiltonbooks.com, and grab yourself a free book there. And by doing so, you will be getting the news, what's coming next, and keeping up to date. And speaking of what's coming next, I am finally publishing Welcome to Smileyland, the book that has started my Smileyland world. And I'm very excited. I've had so many readers demand that they get their hands on a physical copy. And so it's going to be finally happening this summer.
Nice. That's really exciting. Was the same iconic cover art?
That same image, yes. It will be, updated a bit, but yes.
That's fantastic. Well, people should definitely go and pick themselves a copy of that, and go onto your mailing list and stay up to date. Spencer, again, great fun having this conversation. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast, and good luck for the upcoming weeks, months, and years ahead.
Dave, thank you. You as well.
So there we go. Told you that was another good episode. Huge thanks to Spencer for his time. This was one I've been trying to book in for ages, and we finally made it happen. And I'm so glad we did. I think you'll agree Spencer has been a brilliant addition to this already stellar roster of interview guests that we've had for this podcast this season and for last season as well. And we're not done yet. There's 2 more left in this season. Do go and check out Spencer, find his work, and God, I don't know about you, but I'm very excited about the possibility of actually holding the Welcome to Smileyland book in my hands rather than just having it on my Kindle. That printed edition that's due this summer, that's going to be something pretty special to own. Do make sure you pick that one up. And of course, in the description, all the links you need for finding Spencer. And, if you want to find me as well and some of my work, they're all there. Go and check them out. And if you liked this, tell a friend, share this episode with a friend. Remember, you can watch them on YouTube or you can listen wherever you get your podcasts. Any support in spreading the word would really, really help. And I guess the biggest thing you can really do next is come back next time because, well, you're not going to have to wait long until I come back and see you again with another Constant Writer very, very soon.